Go back to Wakanda. Pam Bondi thought it was just a jab. But Jasmine Crockett's calm, razor-sharp response left everyone in that studio and across the country speechless. The air inside the studio was thick with tension before anyone said a word. It was a Thursday night in Tallahassee, Florida. A special televised roundtable on criminal justice reform had brought together some of the most polarizing figures in politics. Cameras panned across the sleek glass table, bright studio lights catching every subtle twitch, every glance. The room looked polished, controlled, but something beneath the surface was waiting to crack. At the far end of the table sat Florida's Attorney General, Pam Bondi, perfectly still, her blazer crisp, her expression unreadable. To her left was U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett, sharp-eyed, calm, but visibly fired up. Crockett wasn't one to play soft, not when the topic was personal. And tonight, it was. This wasn't some sleepy debate on paper-pushing legislation. The panel had promised to talk real policy, mandatory minimums, plea deals, racial disparity in sentencing. But as the moderator gave a brief introduction and turned to Bondi, the weight of what was about to happen lingered like thick humidity outside the studio walls. Attorney General Bondi, the host began, you've said before that Florida's system isn't racially biased. Do you still stand by that claim? Bondi gave the kind of answer polished people give. She referenced stats, quoted vague studies. She looked comfortable, unbothered. But then it was Crockett's turn. Sitting forward just slightly, she began, not with fire, but with precision. I represent a district where young men are pulled over for rolling stop signs, where public defenders have 90 seconds to make plea decisions. I've watched mothers pray that their sons survive traffic stops. So, when you say this system isn't racially biased, I have to ask, based on what? Bondi didn't blink. The data's clear. If people obey the law, they don't end up in trouble. It's that simple. Crockett raised her eyebrows. She didn't interrupt. She waited. The moderator tried to shift. Let's talk about sentencing laws. No, Crockett cut in gently. I want to hear her explain that. Is it simple when two kids, one black and one white, both get caught with the same amount of marijuana and only one of them ends up doing time? Because I've seen that. More than once. Bondi adjusted her posture. Congresswoman, with all due respect, anecdotal stories don't override the law. This isn't about race. It's about behavior. There was a pause, and for a moment, it seemed like the argument might settle into the usual political tennis match, stats versus stories, deflection versus pressure. But Crockett didn't let it. You say it's about behavior, she said slowly. I'm saying behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. I'm saying we have to look at what kind of environment produces that behavior and how our system responds to it based on who's involved. Bondi gave a tight smile. Sounds like you're trying to rewrite reality. I live in the real world. Maybe you live in Wakanda. That's when it happened. It was quick, sharp, and deliberate. Why don't you just go back to Wakanda? For half a second, no one moved. The studio felt frozen. Not the kind of silence that follows a pause, but the kind that sits heavy on your chest. Even the cameraman standing behind the third rig lowered his hands. One of the producers muttered, "Did she really just say that?" The moderator blinked hard, as if trying to decide whether to pretend he hadn't heard it or press the emergency brake on the entire show. Crockett didn't say a word, not yet. She just looked straight at Bondi. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her face didn't change. But something about the way she held herself in that chair, the stillness, the pause, the composure, it said everything. The audience couldn't look away. But Crockett's response was coming, and nobody in the room was ready for what she had to say. The silence cracked, first in whispers off camera, then in low gasps barely caught by the boom mic. Pam Bondi didn't stutter. She wasn't joking. The way she said it, with that clipped confidence and just enough bite to seem intentional, told everyone she meant it exactly how it sounded. The moderator cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to confront her directly. Let's keep this civil, please, he mumbled. But Crockett wasn't flustered. She didn't lean in. She didn't raise her voice. She just sat there, her hands folded on the desk, letting the words hang in the air a little longer, letting them sting the way they should. Bondi looked smug for a beat too long. That was her mistake. I'm going to give you a second, Crockett finally said, calm but piercing, to think about what you just said and how many people heard it. Bondi didn't back down. I said what I said. You brought up fantasy worlds. I responded. Crockett tilted her head. Pam, Wakanda is fictional, but the racism behind telling a black woman to go back anywhere, that's real. And it's old, and it's tired. The moderator, sweating now, tried again. Maybe we should take a moment to... No, Crockett cut in, firm this time. Don't silence this. America needs to hear exactly how this sounds in real time. This is what we mean when we talk about coded language. It's not always a slur. Sometimes it's a jab wrapped in sarcasm, hidden behind a smirk, but the impact's the same. Bondi rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, you're being dramatic. Crockett didn't blink. You just told a sitting congresswoman to go back to a fictional African country. What should I call it? Comedy. The room was tight with tension now. Even the other panelists, some of them who'd walked into the room clearly aligned with Bondi, were shifting in their seats, stealing glances at the floor or the camera. Nobody wanted to be caught smiling or defending it. But Crockett wasn't done. She leaned forward just a little, not aggressive, controlled. When you say something like that, she continued, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting every little black girl who's ever dared to dream, who's ever raised her hand too high in class, or spoke too loud at a town hall, or wore her natural hair to court. You're telling her she doesn't belong here. Bondi opened her mouth to interrupt, but Crockett held up a finger, not rude, just steady. I want every viewer at home to hear this part, she said. The people who look like me, we're not guests in this country. We built it. Our blood is in the bricks. Our stories are in the soil. We've been here, and we're not going anywhere. Bondi looked away for the first time. One of the producers signaled to cut to commercial, but the director shook his head. Keep it rolling, he whispered. There was something electric happening, the kind of moment you can't fake, the kind of moment that doesn't come around twice. Crockett kept going. You don't have to like me, she said. You don't even have to agree with me. But what you won't do is reduce me to a punchline. You won't try to strip me of the right to speak truth just because it makes you uncomfortable. If justice makes you squirm, you might be on the wrong side of it. For once, the moderator let the silence stay. He didn't try to jump in. He couldn't. No one could. Pam Bondi sat stiff, lips pursed tight, trying to find a way to clean it up. But the moment had already landed, and millions of people were watching it live. But this wasn't just about Bondi anymore. This was about what would happen next. Outside that studio, across living rooms, classrooms, barbershops, and boardrooms all over the country. The cameras were still rolling, but something had shifted. The panel wasn't just a debate anymore. It had become a moment, and Jasmine Crockett held it like she'd been preparing her whole life for it. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of what she said came from truth, not volume. I want to tell you something I haven't said on national TV before, she said, eyes locked on Bondi. When I was 12, my older cousin was sentenced to 15 years for a nonviolent drug charge. 15. You know what he did? Sold weed. Not a gun, not pills. Weed. I watched my aunt collapse outside that courthouse. I'll never forget that scream. She looked away for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the floor. That was the day I decided I'd become a lawyer, because I couldn't accept that justice was real if it only showed up for some of us. The studio was quiet. Even the camera crew stood still, holding their breath like a pin could drop. I went to school with kids who made worse mistakes than my cousin, she said. They got rehab. He got time. Their parents got to hold them through it. My aunt got a folded sheet of visitation hours. She looked back at Bondi. So don't tell me about law and order like it's colorblind. Don't talk to me about personal responsibility when your system plays favorites. Bondi didn't respond. She knew better now. Crockett wasn't reading from a script. She wasn't talking for the cameras. She was talking for every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong at the table. For the ones who'd heard, go back to where you came from, at work, at school, or in court, and held it in until it burned. You used Wakanda to mock me, she continued. But I'm going to tell you something. I love that movie. Not because it's fantasy, but because it showed black kids what it looks like to see yourself as brilliant, as powerful, as worthy, and you tried to weaponize that against me. She looked directly into the main camera. And to every kid watching this tonight, don't let them shame you for dreaming. Don't let anyone shrink you because they're scared of what you represent. There was a pause, the kind that felt like the whole world had leaned in. Then she added, softer this time, "This isn't about being offended. I've been called worse. This is about how words reveal values. And tonight, we saw what's behind yours." One of the panelists, a retired prosecutor from Miami named Kenton Rouse, spoke up for the first time. "I've worked in this system for over 30 years, he said, clearing his throat. "And I've seen the bias Jasmine's talking about. It's real. We can't pretend otherwise." Even the moderator looked surprised. Rouse wasn't the type to get involved in culture clashes. But tonight wasn't like other nights. Crockett leaned back. Her job was done. She didn't gloat. She didn't look for applause. Bondi sat quietly, no longer meeting anyone's eyes. A younger panelist, Maritza Ochoa, a public defender from Clearwater, spoke up too. "I've been in courtrooms where my clients were treated like criminals before they opened their mouths. Jasmine's telling the truth, and we need to listen." The tide had turned. What began as a talking head debate had become something much bigger. Crockett hadn't just defended herself. She had turned a jab into a statement, a moment of grace and steel that now belonged to the public. And in living rooms across America, people watched, stunned, some with tears, some with anger. Some just sat with the uncomfortable realization that maybe they'd let comments like that slide before, and maybe that silence had a cost. But Jasmine's calm didn't come from politeness. It came from purpose, and her story wasn't done being told. Jasmine didn't expect her mind to go back there, not in that moment, not on national television. But standing in that studio, the spotlight glaring, Pam Bondi's words still echoing faintly in the room. She couldn't help it. Her voice had gone quiet, but her presence still filled the space. The moderator tried to steer things toward another panelist, but Jasmine lifted a hand, gently this time. She wasn't finished. "I'm thinking about the first time someone told me I didn't belong," she said. And just like that, she was 12 again, standing in the hallway outside her 6th grade classroom in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Her backpack too big for her small frame. Her voice too confident for the teacher who didn't know what to do with a black girl who wasn't afraid to speak. "I raised my hand," she told the audience, "and I corrected the teacher, not disrespectfully, just with the right answer. She told me right there in front of the class, 'Maybe this school isn't the right place for you if you think you're smarter than everyone else.'" She let it sink in. That stuck with me, because I realized that day, it's not always the people in hoods or the ones yelling slurs. Sometimes it's the ones with degrees, with power. They just package the message differently. The studio audience was silent again. Some viewers watching at home were flashing back to their own memories, different places, same feeling. She continued, "I went home that day and didn't say a word to my mother. I just went to my room and cried. Not because I didn't think I was smart, but because I realized that being smart wouldn't be enough." The lights in the studio seemed to dim slightly, not literally, but in energy. No one was looking at their notes. Even Bondi wasn't fidgeting anymore. "That's the thing," Jasmine said. "It starts early. The messages, the quiet nudges meant to tell you this space isn't yours. And if you hear it long enough, you start to believe it. Or worse, you start to shrink yourself to fit in." But she hadn't shrunk. She'd grown louder, sharper, stronger. She became the girl who sat in the front row, the one who didn't let her voice waver during mock trial, the one who read Supreme Court decisions while her friends were watching TV, not because it was fun, but because she needed to understand the game if she was ever going to change the rules. So when someone like Pam tells me to go back to Wakanda, it's not just a slip-up. It's a reminder of every classroom I was told I didn't belong in, every courtroom where I had to prove I wasn't angry, just articulate, every hearing where I was told to smile more so I wouldn't seem aggressive. She looked over at Bondi again, not with hatred, but with the quiet power of someone who had nothing left to prove. "This isn't personal," she said. "It's historical, it's systemic, and it's everywhere. I didn't come here for a fight. I came here for the truth. If it rattles you, maybe it's worth asking why." A long exhale echoed faintly from one of the producers behind the camera. One of the makeup crew in the corner discreetly wiped at her cheek. Jasmine turned to the panel again. "You want to talk justice? Let's talk about who gets second chances and who gets buried by their first mistake." Let's talk about kids who learn to say yes, sir, at age 6, not out of respect, but out of fear. Let's talk about judges who hand out warnings to some and warnings with handcuffs to others. She leaned back slightly. If that makes people uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is how change begins. But the studio hadn't seen the full ripple yet. Outside those walls, the world was just starting to react. The studio didn't move for a full 10 seconds after Jasmine Crockett finished speaking. It wasn't the kind of silence people tried to fill. It was the kind that demanded you sit with it. Breathe in what had just been said. And maybe for the first time that night, nobody rushed to speak next. The moderator glanced at his cue cards, then at the control booth. He was clearly shaken. Everyone was. But the broadcast was live, and dead air wasn't an option. He straightened in his chair. Attorney General Bondi, would you like to respond? Pam Bondi shifted slightly in her seat. Her confident demeanor had thinned out. Her mouth tightened, then she gave a small shrug. Look, she said, if people want to take offense, that's on them. I was being sarcastic. That's all. The studio groaned. It was soft, but it was there. Bondi continued, we can't get to real reform if we're going to stop the conversation every time someone's feelings get hurt. I have nothing against the Congresswoman, but let's be honest. We can't keep dividing this country by making everything about race. That was it, that last line. It hit like cold water. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even look at Bondi this time. She just turned slightly in her seat, facing the moderator. I'm not the one who brought up race tonight, she said. I brought up fairness. I brought up the fact that two people can break the same law and face completely different consequences depending on who they are. If you think that's dividing the country, maybe you're not ready to talk about reform. Bondi folded her arms. You're twisting my words. No, Jasmine said. I'm showing people what they actually mean. A moment later, Kenton Rouse, the retired prosecutor, jumped back in. His voice was low but firm. Pam, I've known you for years. But what you said tonight wasn't just sarcastic. It was dismissive. You don't have to agree with Jasmine, but you can't minimize her reality. Maritza Ochoa added, this isn't about feelings. It's about facts. We can't build trust in the justice system if people in power won't even acknowledge the experiences of those most affected by it. The panel had shifted. What began as a 4-on-4 lineup now looked different. Not because sides had been chosen, but because truth had started to separate posture from principle. The moderator tried to smooth it over. Let's remember, this conversation is about criminal justice reform. What can we all agree on tonight? It was a last-ditch attempt to pull the show back into neutral territory. Jasmine took a breath. I think we can all agree that the justice system should be fair, she said, that kids shouldn't be sentenced based on their zip code, that wealth and whiteness shouldn't determine how much mercy someone gets, and that we can't fix what we won't admit is broken. The studio crew glanced at one another. This wasn't a meltdown. It wasn't a staged moment or a media stunt. It was clarity, raw, uncomfortable, but needed. Bondi stayed quiet. She had played her card, and it hadn't gone the way she expected. The camera zoomed out slightly, catching all 8 people at the table, and for a few seconds more, no one said a word. Back in the control room, the producer finally leaned into his mic. Cut to break in 5, 4, but the director stopped him. No, he said, let it breathe. But the real story was no longer in the studio. Outside, phones were lighting up, clips were being shared, and America had already begun to talk. By the time the broadcast wrapped, the moment had already exploded online. Someone in the control room had clipped the exchange before the show even ended. It hit Twitter first, just a 29-second snippet of Pam Bondi's words, followed by Jasmine Crockett's reply. No music, no editing, just raw footage. Within minutes, the numbers started climbing. Thousands of reposts, then tens of thousands. By midnight, it had cracked 3 million views. The reactions came in waves. At a diner in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a waitress named Jolene watched the clip on her phone during a cigarette break. She really said that? She muttered, shaking her head. A customer near the register overheard and chimed in. She said it plain. On camera, no shame. At a university in Boise, a student played the clip in his dorm room for his roommate, both sitting in stunned silence before one of them whispered, she handled that better than I would have. And inside a barbershop in Toledo, the conversation spilled out of the TVs mounted in the corners and into real debate. An older man said, "I've been hearing that go back line since '63. A younger guy shook his head and added, "Yeah, but she flipped it. Didn't even raise her voice." The moment had moved from broadcast to conversation, from viral clip to cultural checkpoint. Cable news ran it on a loop, analysts trying to decode every glance, every pause. Some conservative commentators tried to downplay it, calling it political theater. But even some of them winced when the words "go back to Wakanda" were played out loud. Others didn't bother spinning it. They just owned the truth of it. Former Judge Barbara Emmons went on a podcast and said, "I've presided over hundreds of cases, and if Jasmine Crockett had been in my courtroom, I'd have trusted every word she said." That wasn't outrage. That was composure. The president was asked about it during a press briefing. He avoided mentioning Bondi by name, but said, "Words matter. Leaders must be careful not to make people feel small for simply demanding justice." In churches, Sunday sermons included references to the exchange. In classrooms, teachers used it to spark conversations about civics, power, and language. But not all the reactions were praise. Some people took to Facebook to defend Bondi, accusing Crockett of playing the race card. Others tried to dismiss the entire thing as just more identity politics. But even in those corners, something had shifted. The old tactics of denial and distraction didn't hit the same. The clip existed. The silence that followed Bondi's words spoke louder than any counterpoint. One high school teacher in Lansing, Michigan, printed out the transcript of the exchange and handed it to her seniors. "Read this," she said, "then tell me what justice looks like to you." At a community center in Fresno, California, a teenage girl named Amina told her youth group, "I want to be like her, not because she's a congresswoman, but because she didn't let that woman change her tone. She stood up without losing herself." Meanwhile, Crockett stayed quiet. She didn't tweet. She didn't post a reaction video. She went home. People close to her said she had dinner alone that night, not in sadness, but in stillness. She knew the storm was coming, but she also knew it wasn't about her anymore. It was about what people saw in her, and they saw a mirror. Not perfect, not flawless, but honest. Human. But before the moment could fade into headlines and hashtags, Jasmine had one last thing to say, and this time, it wasn't for the cameras. 3 days after the broadcast, Jasmine Crockett stood alone in a quiet hallway of the Capitol, just outside her office. Her heels echoed faintly against the marble floor. She had turned down every interview request, skipped every morning show, ignored the trending hashtags using her name. Instead, she was writing. Not a press release, not a tweet, a letter. It was addressed to a 14-year-old girl named Zora, who had written to her months ago. Back then, it was just a small card, neat handwriting, black ink on pink paper. Zora had asked what it was like to speak up when people don't want to hear your voice. That question had stuck with Jasmine more than she let on. Now, with the country watching her, she pulled out that old card and smiled. Then she began to write back. "Dear Zora," she wrote, "the world won't always clap when you speak. Sometimes it flinches. Sometimes it rolls its eyes. And sometimes it tells you to sit down before you've even stood up." She paused, thinking about that night in the studio. "But you speak anyway, not because it's easy, but because it matters. You speak because someone's listening who needs to know they're not alone. You speak because silence has never protected anyone." She signed it, folded it carefully, and handed it to her assistant with a quiet, "Mail this today." Moments later, a staffer knocked gently on her door. "There's someone asking to see you. She says she was inspired by the round table. Drove all the way from Pensacola. She brought her daughter." Jasmine nodded. "Let them in." The woman who walked through the door was in her 40s. She wore a faded t-shirt with the words, "Protect Black Girls," across the front, and clutched a folder with documents sticking out. Her daughter, maybe 11 or 12, stood close by. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice shaking. "I didn't think anyone would stand up like that. Not on TV, not with that much pressure." Jasmine smiled gently. "You stood up by coming here." The girl spoke up shyly. "Can I be a lawyer too?" "You already sound like one," Jasmine said. "All you have to do is keep asking questions that make people uncomfortable." The girl laughed. So did her mother. The mood lightened, but the moment held weight. Outside, the headlines were still churning. Bondi had issued a half-hearted statement saying her words were misunderstood. Some politicians called for an apology, others didn't say a word. But inside that office, something quieter and more meaningful was happening. Connection, affirmation, proof that courage doesn't need an audience, it just needs intention. Later that week, Jasmine finally spoke publicly on the House floor. No cameras, no dramatic setup, just a quiet speech that wasn't about Pam Bondi at all. "I want to thank the people who reached out to say they felt seen," she said. "That's who I was speaking to. That's who I'll keep speaking for. This job isn't about sound bites. It's about showing up, even when your voice shakes, even when the room wants you quiet." A few heads turned, some nodded, some didn't. She continued, "Leadership isn't always loud. Sometimes it's standing still while the world tries to shout over you. Sometimes it's answering ignorance with grace, not for them, but for the people watching who need to see that grace is possible." She finished, gathered her papers, and stepped down without looking back. Outside, her assistant caught up to her. "There's a lot of interest in your next move," she said. "People want to know what you'll say next." Jasmine gave a small smile. "I think I already said it." Because the truth wasn't in the broadcast or the trending hashtags or even the applause. The truth was in who felt braver afterward and who stayed quiet long enough to finally listen.